How often can illegal immigrants use alternative identification, such as a warrant or a notice to appear?
Administrator, what specific steps is the agency taking to better balance its use of advanced imaging technology with the civil rights and dignity of diverse passengers?
I think we've taken a number of steps. We still have more to take.
So how are you protecting the American flying public when you are diverting these federal air marshals to the southern border?
We determine the flights that we need to put air marshals on based on risk. And I'd be happy to give you a brief, again, not appropriate for this setting.
I think for most Americans, they're going to say that's kind of unsatisfactory.
We're hazing the chair.
No more second round questions. We're adjourned until the committee members do some customer service training.
Looking at the future, can you tell us, is TSA in a particular position right now where we can have more of that innovation for transportation systems, or we're looking at just simply hiring more personnel, build out the airports? Tell us a little bit how you can leverage technology. And by the way, once you get rid of some technology, is there a way that y'all can maybe provide that to local jails or local facilities that might be able to use some of your technology? And I don't know what your process is to dealing with that.
Yes, sir. I'll take the last part of the question first. The process for dealing with excess equipment for any federal agency is to access it to the GSA, and then the GSA advertises it across to state, local governments and to the public, and then goes through a process to determine what the best use of that equipment is for.
How often can illegal immigrants use alternative identification, such as a warrant or a notice to appear, or the one app from the CBP to fly on commercially?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your comments, first off, on the TSA workforce. I greatly appreciate that, and I'm very proud to have the opportunity to serve with them and provide transportation security across the entire United States, and indeed influence transportation security globally. So thank you for those comments. With respect to the strategic adjustments in the Federal Air Marshal Services funding, what that basically stands for is that TSA is now 23 years old, and we are reaching a point where we're seeing more and more federal air marshals eligible to retire. And then when they retire, their replacements will often be of lower band or lower steps in the band. And so this is just an adjustment to account for that flow, which we anticipated several years ago. I mean, we knew we were going to hit a point where we had a lot of people becoming retirement eligible, and they have a year limitation of 57 as well. But there is a reduction that affects the Federal Air Marshal Service, just to highlight for you, and that's the VIPER program, the Visible Intermodal Protection and Response Program. We have 31 teams comprised of 7 federal air marshals that are stationed around the United States that provide a visible law enforcement presence to augment state and local efforts. And we primarily operate, of course, in transportation hubs, both surface and airport.
So how good is that? You can tell that yes, that's the person that was apprehended at the border, but beyond that, there's no backward.
Yes, sir. What it has is, one, CBP, both the Border Patrol and the Office of Field Operations go through a process to look at the documentation that the person had presented at the border crossing, and to look at all the holdings that we have to be able to attach an identity to that individual. So there's a lot of process that CBP performs in that regard, and then all of the documentation for that is included in the CBP One app. From our perspective, we do require that the passenger submit to facial recognition technology. So if you opt out of the facial recognition technology, we don't allow you to continue with the screening process. But if we can match you as being admitted by CBP, then we proceed with the additional screening.
I understand that TSA has a disability and multicultural coalition that collaborates with the agency to identify promising practices for TSA's non-discriminatory delivery of security. Yet even coalition stakeholders share that, quote, while TSA has taken some positive steps that may help prevent discrimination, it has not made meaningful changes to address the longstanding concerns that have been raised, end quote. At the time of GAO's report, which was October 2023, TSA still had not collected data on referrals for additional screening or assessed the potential for its practices to result in discrimination. Administrator, what specific steps is the agency taking to better balance its use of advanced imaging technology with the civil rights and dignity of diverse passengers?
No, thank you for the question, and I think we've taken a number of steps. We still have more to take. With the advanced imaging technology, we have recently installed a software update to that technology. So what that software update does is it is better at detecting any anomalies that a person may have in areas that are sensitive parts of the body. And so we knew we needed to focus there because we were seeing in our testing results that was where people were secreting things. And what the software update also did was, importantly to your question, it reduced the false alarm rate by about 50%. And so when you alarm on any system, particularly on person screening, what we're required to do is to do a pat-down, which is very uncomfortable for passengers, very uncomfortable for our officers. That 50% reduction is real. We've seen it in operation. We do have another software update in the works that should be out in the next couple of years that further halves that false alarm rate and further improves the ability to detect. And that will be coupled with an improvement in the antenna systems that are within that technology. They'll basically go from standard definition to a high definition antenna system. So we think that with technology, we will make significant improvements. But to your point and to the GAO's point, collecting data, so we're looking at data-based decisions is something we're working very hard on, and we do agree with them on that point.
So how are you protecting the American flying public when you are diverting these federal air marshals to the southern border to assist CBP in administering aid to illegal immigrants?
Congresswoman Hinson, thanks for the question, and to your first request for process clarity, absolutely would be happy to do that. And with respect to your second question on federal air marshal deployments to the southwest border, that is a very small number, not a number I can give you in this setting, but we'd be happy to brief you on that number and how it's changed
I've
over
been
time.
briefed by the Federal Air Marshals Council, and they say it's too many, right? And I think that's the biggest concern
Sure.
is that these air marshals are designed to be keeping the flying public safe with the 40,000 some flights we have every day. That is their mission and that is their duty. And so any instance where they are being pulled away from their mission, I think, is a morale problem. You talk about recruiting and hiring and how much of a challenge you're having there, having to rehire people who've been retired. I mean, I think this is a long-term, huge recruitment problem if people are coming into this thinking they're keeping this guy safe and they're being diverted to the southern border. Do you not?
I don't. First off, the diversion to the southern border is a very small percentage, like I said. That's a temporary mission, not a permanent mission of TSA's. It's something we started back in 2019, and we've made significant improvements to it over time. We have a memorandum of understanding with CBP, which is the requesting agency. I'd be happy to share that with you if you haven't seen it. I will tell you from my chair, I'm responsible for transportation security. I have federal air marshals on every flight I desire to have federal air marshals on, pure and simple.
What risk algorithms are you using to determine what flights you're pulling them off of?
We determine the flights that we need to put air marshals on based on risk. And I'd be happy to give you a brief, again, not appropriate for this setting, as to how we make those decisions.
Documentation that CBP looks at when people are entering, which is a very generous assumption in the best case scenario of somebody coming across our border. Because usually, if they have ID, they're dropping it at the border, they're coming across, and they get into our database just by saying whatever they want to say. What's your name? It could be your real name, could not be. What's your age? Could be your real age. Your nationality could be a made-up nationality. And that's by and large how a lot of our database is being presented. And then you're saying that when they get onto airplanes, all you're doing is checking to make sure that they are the person they pretended to be before. So I think for most Americans, they're going to say that's kind of unsatisfactory. Could you speak to anything that you're doing to firm that process up?
Well, I think, sir, the most important thing we're doing is they're all receiving additional screening at the checkpoint, right? All of them, without exception. And that would be just like any other passenger who didn't have an acceptable form of ID. They all get additional screening. So we mitigate risk significantly in that process. So that's an important thing to keep front and center. And you know, our acceptable forms of ID are constantly being adjusted, and you will see us come out over the next several months and further reduce the numbers of acceptable forms of ID, just to further strengthen that process.
You mentioned that that's only a handful this year? Is that new policy that's been put in place, or what are we doing to make sure that air marshals continue in their, what we understand their stated mission to be?
Right. Well, so we put the number of air marshals down on the border based on, part on what CBP's needs are, but based mostly on what our capacity to provide without impacting aviation security. And so that's been the guiding post for us all along. The numbers will vary a little bit, but we have adjusted them downward this year already. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Air Marshal Service has many missions under its portfolio. One of them is to support other federal law enforcement agencies in the work they do. You mentioned that they were doing mostly administrative tasks. That's not the data that I have. We have an MOU with CBP that requires that they primarily perform law enforcement tasks when they're deployed to the southwest border. Otherwise, we would deploy a different person to perform that function. Right.
Well, I can say, just generally speaking, probably 75% of the people on the mission down there to secure our border are doing processing. So, maybe you're saying they're replacing the boots on, but we do need to get back to protection over processing. That's a little bit outside of your jurisdiction, I realize, but.
Right, but that is absolutely not the data that I have. It shows that they, on occasion, will do some processing, but that by far is not the majority of what they're doing.
Are you telling me I'm out of time? I'm up, apparently.
What impact does that have on the availability of people in the air protecting the flying public? What numbers are being pulled off of that job to do Viper?
Sir, the Viper program has a little over 200 members to it. So when you consider, and again,
They're rolling in and out.
yes, they are. But a very important point to raise here is that, and you and I talked about this last time we met, and I appreciate your time, and I enjoyed that conversation with you. One of the things I look at is, particularly with the Air Marshal Service, do I have the capability to surge if the threat indicates that I need to put more air marshals in flight, because it is risk-based. And, sir, to your point, we do try to balance. Having somebody flying for an entire career is not what air marshals need. They need to have a little bit of balance in that whole process. So we're trying to find a way to build meaningful work across the entire transportation sector, surface and aviation both, but always have the surge capacity to bring air marshals to in-flight operations should the need arise. And the other thing that's a big factor here is it takes a while to develop somebody into a fully certified air marshal. That's not something that occurs in 6 months or even a year. And so having that capacity is really important to us. And the Viper program has been important to work alongside state and local law enforcement officials to protect transportation infrastructure overall.
And the budget for that last year, if I remember right, was about 60 million?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, and so can you, I'm sure you don't have it with you, but can you give me a report on Viper results? How many operations did they run across the country? How many arrests did they make? How many, whatever you're grading the success of the program on.
Okay, yes, sir.
Let me
Okay.
have that information.
Great.
And
Just one thing, sir, on the arrest data. When Vipers are working alongside state and local, and as sheriff, you understand this better than almost anybody, is that when an arrest is made, our desire is to have that arrest be made locally, because the processing through all of the judicial process is much faster when you do it that way. So the arrest numbers are not something that we particularly drive. We're trying to work with partners to support them in that effort.
There's times where some of those folks should understand what customer service is.
Yes, sir, and we're building that into our entry-level training now as well. We added a week to our training, and that week is focused on de-escalating situations in checkpoint operations and interactions between officers and passengers.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for a second.
Iowa
We just got the number one,
draft pick, that's right.
That's right.
Get your state correct, Mr. Chairman. We're hazing the chair.
No more second round questions. We're adjourned until the committee members do some customer service training.
I'm
To the friendly representative from Iowa, the floor is yours for a second round.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for the time. I am so grateful that you yield that time to me. I want to thank you for working with us, setting up that walkthrough with Trent and Tracer. They were great sports, and Doug and Yolanda, our Cedar Rapids folks, who helped us really showcase, and especially to local media, so that our constituents could know as well firsthand the issues that veterans with service animals might be facing. So can you speak a little bit to kind of the follow-up there? What's happened since that walkthrough? What are you doing to interface with veterans to make sure they have a better experience on the customer service side going through a checkpoint?
No, thank you, and thank you for facilitating that conversation with Sergeant Dirks and getting to meet him and his team, bringing them down to the airport, getting their feedback on things overall. Good news is that he has joined our multicultural coalition, so that's a great voice to have in that coalition. And we've already put out additional guidance on our webpage. Is hey, if you're traveling with a service dog, here are the things you can expect going through the screening process. And we have a lot of social media capability within TSA too, so if somebody tweets that, it will give them that answer back literally within a couple of seconds. We also have put in place passenger support specialists throughout our system. So if any passenger thinks they need additional assistance in the screening process, they can call ahead and we will meet them and then help them get through the screening process, which is really good for them. It makes them feel valued and makes them not feel deprioritized in the entire system. It's also good for us because it makes it more efficient overall. So no, really appreciate the connect that you made there. Thank
I
you.
wanted to ask you about the law enforcement officer reimbursement program, and you mentioned that you were making some cuts to it. I think by my calculations, it's like 90%. So that's pretty substantial. I'm from a rural town and a rural community with a rural airport, and so that's concerning to me. I'm curious about the thinking there, and then also, I mean, what's the 10% left for if So yeah, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, sir. In the budget, we have proposed for a good number of years to reduce the funding for both the canine reimbursement program, which reimburses canine handlers that are operated by law enforcement agencies, and then law enforcement officers that serve in airports in and around checkpoints. The first year it was accepted by Congress was last year, and so those are FY24 cuts. The hard part for us is that this is only because of budget limitations, no other reason. We just don't have the money.
Plussed up your budget pretty substantially.
Right,
overall.
but we had very high priority things that we needed to fund with that plussed up money, and so it's it's a whole matrix of hey, what's most important, and then how much funds do you have available. I would go back to the 1.6 billion that we're leaving off the table every single year from the aviation security passenger fee. I mean, when you look at your ticket and your ticket stub, it says 911 security fee, 560 one way, 1120 round trip. In 2013, in the BBA, the Balanced Budget Agreement, $1.6 billion in $24 and $25 goes straight to the Treasury Department for deficit reduction. That's what we've been trying to stop overall, and those funds will help, kind of lift us up substantially across the board. I really appreciate all the work that law enforcement officers do. The last thing I want to do is cut law enforcement support. Trust me.
All right, okay, well, I appreciate that. On the ID issue, I had an interesting, you were speaking to some of the most traveled people, obviously, in the country, where I presented a valid boarding pass and an ID, and for some reason it didn't match in what was in the TSA system. I went back to the desk, printed it out again instead of using my digital one. It was the same case, and they were going to not let me board the plane. And again, in the context of who we are letting board planes, I was curious as to how in the world that was even legally possible. And of course, the bigger concern wasn't my one flight. I can get a different flight or whatever. Is this happening to other people?
Sure, and I would just go back and for those that don't have acceptable ID, all get additional screening. So they're not getting pre-check privileges.
What's the legal, like, for somebody who is presenting legal documents, how is the TSA like saying you can't go on this flight if
Sure.
you're presenting legal stuff?
Well, what happens there, sir, is that when you make a flight reservation, we get the reservation data from the carriers beginning about 72 hours out. And we start to vet the information the carriers provide. And essentially what we're doing is we're taking your name and your date of birth, and we're matching it against our holdings to make sure that, hey, if you are a pre-check passenger, we know you're a pre-check passenger. If you're, importantly, a passenger that requires additional screening, that we identify you there as well. Sometimes that match doesn't work as well. There might have been an issue where you had a middle initial once and didn't have it a second time, or some very small changes very small changes will cause a mismatch there, and we need to be sure that the match is correct.
If you have the ability to, in your vetting of these sorts of things, pick some folks out who are TSA pre-check to deny boarding a plane who happen to be members of this committee, we'd like to work with you to figure out who we want this week and that. Because there are some weeks, and I won't speak for anybody else on the committee, it's like, really, I can't get on the plane? Okey doke. And with that softball lead in, Mr. Rutherford, the floor is yours.
When you submit your budget to the president, does it have your relief factor built in? Because that's a big number. I mean, you're talking about, the average for an 8-hour shift is like 1.35. So.
Sir, the biggest factor in what we submit is, and one, for us, is the formula, how we work the formula to figure out what kind of contingency we want to build in there. It would be a very small percentage, but it does factor out in a larger airport. It could factor out to a good number of people. The biggest issue we face oftentimes is volume growth. I mentioned in my opening statement that we saw 12.9% volume growth 2023 over 2022. Really, the projections when the budget was submitted was 4.5%, and so you're constantly behind in volume growth. The challenge always becomes being able to bring somebody on board, get them certified, which is at least a 6-month process, so that they can be fully utilized in the checkpoint operation, particularly during the summer months, because that's, we're busy from 4th of July all the way to the second week in August, busiest, except for Thanksgiving, which the Sunday after is generally the most busy day we ever have.
The subcommittee stands adjourned.